No pressure. So there's two slots I always try to avoid when you speak at a conference. The first one, of course, is right after lunch. That's always tough, right? But with KK there, everyone's listening. The other is when you have a soccer event that happens during your presentation. So out of respect for everybody who is DVRing the match right now, if there's any scoring, let's just keep that to a minimum, okay? So that's all I ask. So my name is CJ Randall. I'm the Director of Sales Engineering at Xavier Labs. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about the toolkits that you're choosing for this discussion around continuous delivery. Because it's important, we've heard it a lot today where you have different organizations, they're struggling at different phases of this thing called continuous delivery. And even talking at lunchtime, talking with folks at the table, some people are very early on in the process. They're just trying to figure out, how do I get started in this space? And then you listen to amazing stories about what's happening at Fidelity, and you see, wow, this is real. This is something we can actually do. So, if you want to feel like Captain Obvious, you stand up in front of a room like this after all we've heard today, and you say, what's wrong with software delivery today? But as we know, there's the high error rates that we want to go after, the lots of delays, and the manual processes. And the thing that we're going to focus a little bit more on today is, as the question came up earlier after one of the talks, a lot of this is, a lot of these problems that we encounter is based on organizational type silos and process silos. So a lot of times the technology is actually the easy part to solve in your organization. So of course we're here to talk about Jenkins. So one of the things I was asked to do is talk a little bit about what we're seeing out in the world of Jenkins and what we use. So we love it. We use it ourselves internally as we develop our tools. So a funny thing that happened, they asked us to give a listing of the plugins that we like to use. And if you're new to Jenkins, there's a couple people I've talked to today that are just starting to use Jenkins. If you ever want to feel like a kid in a candy store, just go to the available plugins page, and then all of a sudden you're like, I can do that too? That's cool. So a couple, I picked 4 for each slide, but a couple that we like to use internally, the Build Failure Analyzer. This is a great plugin because when we're trying to understand why things are failing, especially with infrastructure issues, this is a great plugin to use for that. The Matrix Reloaded plugin, we really like to use this because matrix building is really hard to do. And so this plugin has enabled us internally to very quickly start to manage that type of those problems that you encounter. Promoted Build plugin, we like that one, of course, because as developers are churning out all this code, there's this tremendous amount of pressure to add all these features, enhancements, and fixes. It really gets confusing to try to figure out which one is the good one that I actually want to push forward. So that's a plugin we like to use for that reason. And then, of course, throttling. That's always a fun conversation, right? So we use internally the concurrent builds plugin because, of course, there's a lot going on in Jenkins. We want to make sure not only are we moving quickly, we're also controlling it in the way that is appropriate for our delivery process. So out in the field, I started thinking about, I work with a lot of customers that are using Jenkins. So what am I seeing out in the field? Well, one of them, this came up at lunchtime, is the question was, how do teams communicate about what's going on in Jenkins? So one of the easy ways to do that, who here is using the Build Monitor plugin? Do we have folks using that today? The worst thing in the world is at a conference to ask a question and nobody answers. If nobody's using that, then I highly recommend you start to. It's a great way for you to put your results of your builds up on a screen. And that ability to start to communicate what's happening in the tool helps your teams understand not just what, yes, my application built, but what else is going on? What else is happening in my target systems? The Swarm plugin, I actually was just at a customer this week. I hadn't seen this before in use, but this is, it's pretty neat. It enables slaves to auto-discover their nearby Jenkins. So, if you're really struggling with having multiple Jenkins instances, this is a great plugin to use. The Shelve Project plugin, does anybody use that one? No one? That's called the delayed trash can plugin. You don't really want to throw it away, but you want to just shelve it for a little while. And then the timestamp plugin, this is actually really handy. We just started using this internally because, of course, you have your builds running, you have everything working, everything's, you're automating more and more. It's important to understand what is slowing you down. So that's a really great plugin that we've adapted to do that. Okay, So that's what we're using internally. That's how we're addressing some of our needs. One of the things as I go through this talk today is I think it's important to remember this. We talk about continuous delivery and we talk about toolkits, what you're building in your organization. I think it's pretty apparent that the processes and tools that you're choosing, right, that you're incorporating for achieving continuous delivery, they need to get you to production faster. So this is a quote that we use internally, and it's critical to remember that all your decisions are made with that's your goal in mind, okay? How do I get to production faster? Because you could have the coolest technology and development, if you're not getting it to production, it's not helping you, okay? So, when do you start to hit, so we've been talking a lot about Jenkins and the plugins and all the features and the functions. One of the things that I tend to have conversations around in my role is when do organizations start to hit the edges, the problems of a CI tool, okay? So sometimes they come to us and they say, we're having problems delegating security across our organization. So, that concept where you say I have to have different privileges and rights as I promote from dev to prod. Or reporting. So even in this room alone, I would imagine there's all different types of reporting and compliance and security type reporting needs that are important for your application delivery process. So maybe you're struggling with that with your CI tool today. So Jenkins has a great problem, right? It can do everything. Jenkins literally, it's amazing how creative people get with Jenkins. And so people continue to expand that and technically. And unfortunately, sometimes you do hit those organizational limits. So when you start to hit that problem, I think that's one of the times that people start to think about, maybe I need to add more tools to my toolkit, okay? So it's the onion of continuous delivery. The onion is bigger than Jenkins. And so as you start to unwrap the onion, you keep incurring more and more pain. By the way, I like the Play-Doh example much better, so maybe I'm going to drop that, if you don't mind me borrowing that. But, right, so, as you start to peel back your problem set, it's a very common conversation for people to have as they say, okay, I'm going to focus on this one thing, and you work really hard to solve that problem, like continuous integration. Then you say, wow, that's really great. Okay, let's move on to testing. Well, do you notice that as you start to peel back that onion? It's organizational problems and pain you start to hit, not just technical challenges. So one of the things that I think is pretty obvious is that as you're hitting those changes, hitting those problems, usually one of the outputs of that people see is that it's the consumer audience that's not happy, okay? So you say, you can have some really good tools in place, but who has to consume the information that comes out of them? And that's an important aspect of getting continuous delivery right in your organization, okay? So the first question I'll ask is this: how do you productionalize your tools? How do so who here today works in an organization where there's one guy or gal and they manage the Jenkins installation? Show of hands? Okay. We actually just spoke in Boston yesterday. It was pretty incredible. It literally half the room. Okay. So who here, has a team of people that manages your Jenkins installation? Right. That's better to see, right? So all of a sudden you have a team, right? You have a group of people that are probably interacting and talking about this. That's important. And, by the way, it's much easier with a team to get those toolings towards production, okay? So when you start thinking about your toolkit, how are they being chosen? Who is bringing those tools in? Now, normally in an organization, Jenkins is a great example, it's usually brought in by a small group of people because they say, I've done this really cool thing before in another organization, or I did some research, I went to a conference. It's that getting that momentum internally is sometimes hard, finding that champion. Because once you find success on that, more and more people want to use it. But then you have to start to ask other questions. Who maintains that set of tools, okay? Who manages upgrades and compliance and, versioning and all that? That's a question you have to ask yourself as you build your toolkit. One thing that I think is true, unfortunately, and what I tend to find is most organizations actually try to limit or avoid this cross-team conversation. They say, your tools are your tools, my tools are my tools, and never the twain shall meet. So really, and isn't that true? That's not a technology problem at all. That's a group of people not willing to work together. So obviously one of the first things as you think about productionalizing your toolkit, you start to think of the conversations, the partners that you're going to have to find in your organization just to get that conversation started. And I think Tim pointed that out really well in his presentation. That came through loud and clear. He's partnering with people. He's finding other people that want to be champions. That's a great thing, and it's a hard thing. So what do you need for continuous delivery? Do you guys know this slide? I mean, it applies for the business. Doesn't it kind of look like our CD toolkit also? See, you know, instead of that nice, like again, I like the clay. Instead of the clay that molds together, why does it look like its own little silos? You know, I wanted this, I got that, etc. By the way, there's a website you can make your own of these. If you want the link, I'll send it to you. It's really fun. Okay, so what we're going to talk about now, we're going to kind of take a high-level look at your continuous delivery initiative, okay, and what you're trying to achieve. So from a very high level, we're going to take a look at 5 technical needs for continuous delivery that you're probably trying to work towards in some form. So, you know, continuous integration, deployment, scaling, test, and release management. So, you know, general areas. And then for this conversation, let's take a look at 5 teams that are also involved in this process, you know, to get that application to production faster. So for generalities, we'll say there's a dev team, a QA, a DBA team, a network services team, you know, we all have one of those in our organization, and an operations team. So I have to ask, is there QA folks? There are QA folks in the room. Was that asked earlier? Show of hands. All right, cool. QA is my favorite. And is there any DBAs here in the room? Okay, cool. I was scared yesterday in Boston when I had to ask that question because there's actually DBAs in here. Okay, so let's take a high-level look at what's going on. So for continuous integration, what's the reality of continuous integration? Well, normally what you tend to see is you have a development team, and they've chosen their tools, and they love their tools. They do everything they want to do for their teams. So they can quickly build applications, they can run their tests, they can do all types of code coverage and all type of analytical things using their CI tool. And they're driving that decision. What do you notice as you start getting towards the stack, you know, the path to production, you start getting some kind of weird answers there. You know, like CA says, we don't need a CI tool, right? Or the DBAs, we don't check in SQL code. Has anybody ever heard that one? It's a good one. And then, of course, as you get closer to production, people are even more remotely away from what's a CI tool, or the concept of why you would need that in an environment, okay? So you can easily see why it's so hard to answer what changed. Why did it change? How did it change, right? By the time you get to the business, you know, the people that actually want the changes, they don't even know. They're like, well, I asked for this. You know, there was a great example earlier, the 600-page document. It's actually a miracle that you get out of that, you know, when it's finished. So what are we looking for continuous integration? Well, of course, the dev team's looking for their CI tools. And one thing you want to look for, you probably should choose tooling that builds all the applications across your stack. That's a very nice thing to be able to say. So now you have one tool, it can build all the Windows applications, the Java applications, your legacy apps. And some novel concepts, again, process change. How about if your commits actually relay information about what you change, you know? So your developers actually have to change in the process too. They can't just check in code and say, well, I fixed a variable. You know, it doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help the business understand what this change is. So for the QA team, for continuous integration, you ever think about what it's like to be a QA person? They literally are getting beat on both sides, right? They have the business, they're just hammering them. You know, when is this going to get to production? Why are you slowing everything down? What's taking you so long? And what do you got on the other side, the developers? What's taking you so long? Why can't I get my code into QA? So you have QA trying to orchestrate information across two groups. That's what they're, you know, that's one of their challenges. They're trying to understand what's going to happen when I accept this change? And how am I going to relate that back to say that it's ready to go in production? That's a little side story. I worked for a long time at a healthcare company up in Massachusetts. You remember the commercial, I fall and I can't get up? You know, the woman pushed her button? So that wasn't my company, but that's what we did. Well, I can tell you this. As a developer in that organization, if you checked code into production and it had a bug in it, people could die. Literally. You're talking about elderly subscribers, at risk, etc. You know what? QA becomes your best friend in your application release process. And why is that? Not because I want to blame them if I made if I made a mistake. It was because it was a more partner relationship that said, I've tested everything that I think could happen. Can you take a look at this? Can you help me understand if there's other problems? So again, when you're talking about continuous integration, that can be part of that conversation. I, TJ, the developer, can talk to QA in a way that says, here's the changes I made, here's how they relate to what we're trying to deliver, okay? For the DBA teams, come on, check them in, your SQL code. For the network services team, scripts are code, check them in. Everyone starts to understand what is happening as we deliver an application towards production. And of course, the business at the end of the day, they want visibility into what's changing. Do we have, does it have to be as robust as formal reports and things like that? I don't know. It depends on your organization. But your CI tool should be able to provide them something. Okay, so we'll keep moving here for deployment. What's the reality of deployments in your environment today? So you probably today, you have some tools, some custom scripting, some magic sauce, some manual deployments. You probably have, hopefully you have more than that. You have automated deployments. You don't have to worry about it. But the key here is we're focusing on dev. So if you're only automating in dev, you have big problems because guess what? You're not doing it consistently up the chain. So your developers are almost like hogging all the candy. You're like, come on guys, start to spread out the wealth. Another interesting thing that happens with deployment automation is this. You get a really good process in development, you get things working, and you know what QA says? We're not putting that in our environment. So all of a sudden you've hit a boundary because maybe they don't understand exactly what this thing is that works so well for you in the development team. They don't understand, okay, it's okay to automate deployments up into a QA environment, which is intended to be restricted, right? QA wants to control their environments. That's cool. But they also have to have a trust relationship with the development team that says, we're going to trust that the code that you put in is the code that you said it is, okay? So for the database team, the reality of this, database deployments, automating database deployments is hard work. Unfortunately, what I generally tend to find is it's glossed over into, you just can't do it. You can't automate database deployments. Just give us a phone call when you're ready to go. Is that pretty annoying? Does anybody else experience that? Okay, cool. There's no DBAs here, right? It gets worse. I'm telling you. No. So again, the database team has an interesting job in themselves. They need to keep this container, this thing called the database, up and running all the time. But they'll divert the attention of, well, it's your application code running inside of it. So there's this boundary, this silo that demands communication, and that's hard communication too. So your network services team, they're another one. They're kind of like QA. So they're not necessarily in the picture of the application release process, but applications keep getting dumped into an environment, and then their network, they start having problems in their environments. The network starts going crazy. They're like, what the heck just changed? So they're not part of the communication flow. It's no wonder they get pissed when things start to break in QA. They're like, who told you to put that in there? So deployment becomes a very hard reality for your network team in lower environments. Usually like a network services organization tends to focus on the production side of things. But we have to remember, we're trying to get things into that production environment, okay? So operations, and then operations, I will always feel badly for operations. Can you imagine being an operator? It's 2 o'clock, it's in the morning on a Saturday night, and we give them an Excel spreadsheet with like 7 tabs of instructions. And then we get mad at them when like tab number 5, they forgot line 62. You're like, how can we expect them to follow that, right? So again, it speaks to that automation problem of you might have a really cool tool down in dev. If we don't get it to your operators, you're not making friends in DevOps, okay? And then the business, this is a classic. The business is generally like, can I log in yet? Is it ready to go? Like, can somebody please tell me? Has anybody ever done that one where you had a really like arduous, hard release and you actually forgot to call the business at the end of it? So you're like, oh, phew, I'm glad we can go home. Oh, wait a minute, we got to call them. Well, so in the end of the day, you have different deployment tools, you have different processes across environments. Okay, so the important thing, the highest level thing to remember is for your deployment automation, you want consistent deployments across all environments. You're not doing CD if you're only doing it to dev and QA. You got to do it all the way to prod, and that's hard. So your development teams get their tooling that ensures fast deployments. They're getting that service model that says, I check in code, it's ready for me to go. The QA team, you start to garnish trust. You start to work with them in a way that says, guess what? I'm going to deploy the package the same way as I did in dev. You're getting the same code base, you're getting the same app. You'll naturally start to get friends in QA because they're like, hey, this is cool. I don't have to take QA offline to do my to receive an application. And so your DBA team, you got to start working with them. Either their code becomes part of a deployment process, an automated deployment process, or you have to think about how can I automate it as far as I can. Maybe you can't break down that wall just yet in your organization. But you got to get to the point where, if it's a 2 a.m. release on a Saturday night, you can't be making phone calls and trading emails. It's got to be, you have to get that automation as far as you can. So your network services team, this is actually a conversation more than anything else, but how do you bring them into the pool, right? Of course they're going to say, I don't need to know what you're doing in QA, don't call me, don't tell me, but they're going to react strongly if you just broke something. So start to work with those teams, start to understand what do you need to know in our application release process. Again, operations, it's pretty obvious, right? Same deployment process as earlier environments. So you're talking about really not just a release pipeline, but a trust pipeline. Everyone up the chain will start to trust you more as you get better at deploying your applications. And so the visibility, I think, the business, the biggest thing for them is, I think, one of the common communication problems with deployments is that the business hears their information back from groups like PMs, or they have emails that say, guess what, next Thursday you'll get your release, or they have a status call every morning where they're talking about these things. Why not have your automation do some of that work for you? So think about areas where you can automate those notifications for the business to help them understand when their changes are available. All right, so scaling. This is a very loose generalization, but some version of realities. This is an important part of it. Is you'll have development teams. They have the scripting and the tools. We work with Puppet a lot. Puppet's amazing, right? And so the development teams are doing all kinds of cool things down in the lower environments, the dev environments, and they're getting their infrastructure that they need. And all of a sudden, things start to change as you go towards production. So a lot of times I'll ask that question to people, who here has an environment where you can register, you can create a ticket to get a VM environment instantiated for you? You guys have that? Everyone else has it automated, you can just get one just like that? People are like, can I get a VM environment? So it's one of those things. Sometimes I'll go to a customer and they'll be using Puppet, and they're like, yeah, of course, it's part of my deployment process. I provision new infrastructure, and then I deploy my application to it. Then you talk to other customers, and they say, yeah, I submit a ticket, and I get it in about 3 weeks. They're like, ooh, that hurts. But again, that's work in progress, right? I'm sure those are things that you need, and you recognize that you need, but it's a lot of reality today. And the other thing that I tried to just call out a little bit is, if you notice, the network services teams in a lot of organizations start to become the servicing entity for this infrastructure. So the development team almost gets carte blanche, like they can get, they can use Puppet and they get their environments and it's great. But then QA says, hey, we need some VMs for load testing. Yeah, you got to go through the ticketing system. It's no wonder QA's mad. That's the whole thing. So the DBAs, have you ever heard this one? You can't scale a database, right? You can't instantiate a new database environment. And then the business, again, you can always tell why the business is confused. We say, hey, that's really cool. We just instantiated this test environment for you. We put the latest snapshot of code in there. And the business says, is that a new URL from yesterday? Where am I logging into? Right? It's no wonder the business gets frustrated with IT. So really, scaling, the problem tends to be around creating and maintaining and accessing these environments that you're spinning up so quickly. So what are you looking for your toolkit? What types of things are you focusing on? Well, of course, you want scaling that is incorporated into your CI process and your deployment process. That's a given. For the DBA team, you know what? Hop in the pool, man. This is a lot of fun to be had. And if it's a struggle in your organization, help them as developers figure out those problems. Because I think sometimes that's where the miscommunication comes in, is maybe the DBAs don't have the necessary technical skills to understand what's happening on the provisioning side. They understand the database side. How about we marry those together? And of course, I think the rest of the conversation, for the most part, tends to be about visibility. Everyone can see clearly what environments, they have the proper access instantiated for them to use it. And the business, of course, the end user, they get to have that presented in a clear way. so they can understand where are these environments that I'm using for my work. Okay, so testing. That was a great presentation before, by the way, on testing. What's the reality of testing? Well, of course, CI tools like Jenkins, they provide a ton of functionality here, and they do that very well. What we tend to find is those tests don't tend to be related to other groups. So you start to, one of the things that I notice with testing when you start to have the conversation is conversations aren't occurring across groups. So, you know, the development team is creating their test bed and they have their testing, but they're not necessarily talking to the QA group who has their set of testing, or, you know, the business who has their set of testing. So all of a sudden you realize you have like these silos where people are maybe even duplicating efforts, where you have some opportunities to actually start to blend those together. One thing I find is the QA teams, they generally tend to use their own tooling. And is that a problem? No. But what you want to do is, when you're looking for this test tool for your toolkit, you need a tool that plays nicely with all the other test tools in the chain. So we just saw a good example of that. How do I say I have these systems? I need to start to understand that information as it relates to each other. So, and share them, by the way. What a novel idea. If QA is creating really great tests, they should be sharing those down, just like the developers should be sharing tests up. The DBAs, this is an actual quote that I heard at my own 2 a.m. release one night. You know, we're trying to test the production release and the data, you know, it's not working, the application's down, and a DBA actually said, well, the database is up. You're like, that's awesome. That gave us angry feelings, okay? So, but again, this is like a foreign concept sometimes to a database team. Why is testing such a challenge on the database team side, where we all have applications where we're deploying to databases? Again, maybe part of the problem is the fact that we as technical people need to help work with the database team in a way that says, you know what, this is an integral part of our delivery process, and we have to figure out a way to do it. And if you start the conversation there, maybe, I mean, that sounds easy to say, hard to do, but it's really what you're asking for at the end of the day. Let me test my entire application. Network services, you know, obviously their testing is focused almost on a different area of the application release process. So they're choosing their own tools, but the information those tools generate relates to your application that you're delivering. It'd be really important and really beneficial if you were able to gather that information as part of your testing process. And then, of course, you know, for the most part, I think operations for testing purposes, it's more of like a validation, like a criteria. They want to understand, are you doing the proper testing? Are you learning from your mistakes? Those types of things. And of course, the business tends to come in here. This is where you get the great, we're going to do our own testing. We have Excel spreadsheets, and we're going to do all this. Do you realize that's a really bad, well, obviously it's a real bad problem, but it's an example of where you can build a lot of trust with the business, but we lose that opportunity. If the business is able to articulate in a spreadsheet what they need tested, how come that doesn't get communicated as part of the functional requirements or any type of requirements or any type of development process that you have? So the business knows what they're looking for. Do they always communicate that well back to the development team? So then the development team, wow, what a no-brainer. I can test for those things before it ever gets to QA, for example, okay? That's not a technical problem at all. That's a communication problem. That's an organizational problem. And unfortunately, a lot of organizations try to solve that by doing what? Creating 400-page documents that say, I want you to test this on Thursday. That doesn't work, okay? So what we tend to find with testing, you get these silos of information, okay? And you start to get this non-consistent testing across environments. So your developers are only testing those certain thresholds, etc. So from your test tool, you really want to get a testing tool that gives you much better and broader coverage feedback. So you want to be able to, like we saw earlier today, you want a testing tool that allows you not only to test in your lower environments, you want to understand what happens to your application across all environments. For the database team, it's not just load testing, right? Your application is doing specific things to a database. You need to be able to test those particular components, right? It's not just about 10,000 transactions a minute and what happens and all those good things. So for your network services team, part of that communication so that they know what's coming down the pipeline, how do you communicate to them to say, here's my application, here's what I expect to happen as I deploy my application, and here's the things I want you to look for as you do your testing on this process. So operations, you want tests that validate a release is successful. So, that just came out. It's really hard to convince operations people to test in production because, you start hitting security issues and you start hitting all these different roles and all these different requirements that you didn't face in the lower environments. But again, that's hard, but it's necessary. That way your operations folks start to trust your deployment process even more also. And of course the business was looking for that feedback, that ability not only to do their testing focused on their needs. Another great thing in that trust relationship, how cool is it if the business says, we just did a release, we tested these things, here's the issues we had with the release, and in the very next release, the developers have already incorporated that into their testing process. QA is actually pretty good at that. They say, okay, this failed, these particular components failed the last time we did the application, and now we've incorporated that into our test suite. How much better is that if we can get that all the way back to the dev teams to say, okay, the next time we release the app, let's do these particular things. And the last component here of continuous delivery is release management, or what we call Excel, okay? So when you're talking about release management is hard, right? You're talking about an enterprise. This conversation automatically hits silos because the minute you say, how do we manage a release across from dev to production, you just hit like 6 silos right along. The minute you said that, you hit that. So what do you find? You find the developers have their tooling that they're using. A lot of times they're communicating to a PM, or some entity that says, here's what I'm working on, here's what I'm going to deliver that. Especially, in all models, in offshore, even if those folks are sitting right in your, in your office, they're trying to, like, leave me alone, leave me alone. By the way, that came out a lot today. The developers are lazy. There's a really great website that used to be up. It was called thelazydba.com. Does anybody remember that one? It had a byline on the bottom. It said, a good DBA is a lazy DBA, meaning script it, fix it, automate it. It was ahead of its time. So anyways, the developers, they're communicating their release management needs and requirements as it relates to them. So, I, TJ, have these 6 enhancements I have to do. Here's when I expect them to be done, okay? And of course, release management, the overall problem, of course, is somebody has to orchestrate this information. So these silos get really challenging really quick. So for QA, their sources of information are now emails, defect systems, they have spreadsheets, they have weekly, daily meetings with PMs. When is this coming? And by the way, they're also struggling across applications because I bet no one in this room is delivering one application into production. So now your QA team is dealing with these multiple streams of information and trying to coordinate that as an overall release. And then of course the DBAs, when it comes to release management, what do they always say? Just call me. I'll deploy your scripts. Like, okay. You ever have that one happen where you call the DBA and they put the wrong scripts for the wrong application in? That's a fun one too. Hopefully not in production. So network services, they've got their own releases to maintain. They're maintaining releases across systems. They have patches to deal with. They have upgrades of their own. Application releases is actually, it impacts them in such a way because they're trying to keep their systems alive. And here we are as developers saying, here, can you do this too? Can you change this too? So releases don't mean the same thing and have the same priority sometimes for your network services teams. Of course, operations, generally I think organizations, especially large organizations, try to understand releases. They'll have meetings, where every manager comes in with their spreadsheet to say when their releases are coming. Does anybody have that in their organization? Only one person? I lived that for a long time. But of course you can see why they do that, because they're trying to consume all of these changes to make sure that they can support them. That's their job. And so they need that feedback mechanism. So they're trying to consolidate information. They're trying to organize information in such a way that says, I know these are the changes that are coming, and I know these are the systems that it will affect. Okay, what am I going to start to look out for? And of course the business, what are they always asking? When is it going to be delivered? Which gets back to our main point. They want it faster. And obviously they want it without defect. So how come our release management doesn't enable that? Okay, so of course, what do we generally get in an organization? It's kludgy, it's manual, there's broken communication, silos, etc. So from a release management tool, what are you looking for? Imagine a world where your continuous integration tools, your deployment tools, your scaling, and your testing information feeds into the release management system. There's a novel idea. There's a lot of activity happening around this application that you want to deliver on Wednesday night? How come you don't have a tool that maintains that relationship and maintains that aggregation of information? So for QA, instead of forcing them into that bottleneck position where they're actually trying to put, hold off dev, hold off the water in the dam as they're trying to tell the business it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, why don't they understand the dates as it relates to the applications as well as it relates to the prescribed dates by the business? Now they have a way to easily see, okay, here's when I will receive the applications and here's when they're going to prod. So the DBA team, we've been kicking them a little bit today, but they have to actively participate. You can't just work in a system where the DBAs get called and then they've done their job and they move on. You really have, this is sometimes a difficult task in an organization, but you got to get them to be part of the release. And that means part of it from dev to prod. And maybe they do have a very simple role. For each deployment into an application, they're a 5-minute phone call. And they're like a service entity for you. That's okay. But when they have problems, when they need to update issues, hey, you can give them support tickets to maintain, JIRA tickets, those types of things. That way they're communicating in the same way as everybody else in the release cycle, okay? That's really what you're looking for. Just give me the feedback that I need, from the database side of the house. So network services, help them to be part of your application release process. So they're not going to necessarily use a release management tool to hopefully they would, but they're not necessarily going to immediately choose a development tool to help them understand their releases of their systems. But imagine if you were able to express to them, instead of that Wednesday meeting with the spreadsheet, express to them in a very visual way, here's the calendar of what we're delivering on our applications. Because now they can start to understand that, to say, oh, we have these releases coming on our side. How do those marry together? What is going to be conflicting? What's going to be bottlenecking? So for operations team, again, it's easy access to this information, and it's all releases. That's the other thing that tends to happen is if you have certain teams using certain tools or certain processes, it's much better when everyone is using the same release management process, okay? And then for the business, the ability to access the information, but even better yet, how about they participate in that information process? So they, instead of, and obviously this is another communication, but they get to join in also. So they don't get permission to take carte blanche to use this release management tool as their hammer to speed things up. But at the same time, who here works in an organization where you allow the business to come in early to do, you allow them early into QA so they can build training materials? Does anybody do that? Okay. Or you allow them in because they want to see a sneak peek of what's coming to make sure it's what they built. Well, that's a cool thing to be able to do. If you're a QA department, it's a little risky, but at the same time, from a release management perspective, imagine if your release management tool allowed you to say, okay, business user TJ, you get to go in. If you have any feedback, update the release management system. So guess what? Your developer downstream gets some feedback on what they're working on. So just something to think about. Okay, so overall, our outline here for continuous delivery tools, we're looking for CI tools that build all applications automatically, right? And give you all the functionality that you need. Deployments, you want a deployment tool that helps you manage across all environments consistently, no matter what the operating system is underneath, no matter the platform. Scaling, we're looking for something that allows you to easily create, modify, and destroy environments, and seamless integration to your deployment tools. Pretty straightforward stuff, we know this, right? Testing, aggregating results from various testing tools, and release management, using a tool that allows all teams to work together under your release process. And so I didn't know if you guys knew that if I was a vendor, but if you want to talk, nobody laughed. Did Uruguay score? Is that the problem? Is that what it is? It's 1-0? Okay, but thank you very much for your time. And if you have any questions, I'll be in the back, so, okay.
Okay, we're going to do some